The herbs grew best in the dangerous places, and Elena Wright had learned long ago that safety was a luxury she couldn't afford if she wanted to keep her patients alive. The Montana hills stretched endlessly before her on that scorching August morning in 1878, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stand of pine. Elena wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her canvas-gathering bag already half full with yarrow, wild mint, and the precious feverfew she'd been searching for all week. At 22, she'd been the closest thing Sloane had to a proper healer for 3 years now, ever since her mother had succumbed to the same winter fever that had taken half the town's elderly population. The sun beat down mercilessly as she knelt beside a cluster of arnica, its bright yellow flowers standing out against the dry grass. Her fingers worked quickly, practiced, taking only what she needed and leaving enough for the plants to recover. She just tucked the stems into her bag when the snap of a twig made her freeze. Elena's heart hammered as she slowly turned her head, expecting a bear or mountain lion. Instead, she found herself looking at a man on horseback, silhouetted against the morning sun. He sat perfectly still, watching her, and even from this distance she could sense his tension. "You're a long way from town, Miss Wright," a familiar voice called out. She recognized him then. Lucas Morgan, one of the ranch hands from the double bar spread just outside Sloane. He was perhaps 24 or 25, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. She'd treated him once for a nasty rope burn, remembered how he'd tried not to wince even though she knew it hurt like the devil. "I could say the same about you," Elena replied, rising to her feet and brushing the dust from her skirts. "This isn't double-bar land." Lucas urged his horse forward, a sturdy bay gelding that picked its way carefully across the rocky ground. "No, madam, it isn't. But I saw you heading up into these hills alone, and I couldn't just let you wander off without someone keeping an eye out." Elena felt irritation flare in her chest. "I've been gathering herbs in these hills since I was old enough to tell Comfrey from Foxglove. I don't need a keeper, Mr. Morgan." "Didn't say you did." He'd reached her now, close enough that she could see the concern etched into his weathered features. "But there's been talk of a rogue grizzly working its way down from the higher elevations. Killed 2 head of cattle last week. And yesterday, some of the men found tracks not 3 miles from here." The irritation dimmed slightly. Elena had heard the talk in town, but she'd assumed it was the usual exaggeration that accompanied any wildlife sighting. "I didn't hear about the tracks. Just found them yesterday evening." Lucas shifted in his saddle, and she noticed the rifle resting across his lap. "Boss sent some of us out to scout the area this morning. I drew the eastern section, and when I saw you heading up this way..." He trailed off, looking almost embarrassed. "Well, I told the others I'd catch up with them later." Elena studied him for a long moment. There was something genuine in his expression, none of the condescension she often encountered from men who thought a woman had no business doing anything more challenging than needlework. "I appreciate the concern," she said finally, her tone softening. "But I still have at least another hour of gathering to do. I can't imagine you want to sit around watching me pick flowers." "Herbs," Lucas corrected, and the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. "And I've got nowhere more important to be. You do what you need to do, Miss Wright. I'll just stay close if that's all right with you." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist on her independence, but the truth was that the thought of a grizzly bear lurking somewhere in these hills made her skin prickle. "All right," she conceded, "but try not to trample anything. Some of these plants are hard enough to find as it is." For the next hour, Elena moved methodically through her favorite gathering spots, while Lucas followed at a respectful distance, sometimes on horseback, sometimes leading his horse on foot when the terrain grew too steep or rocky. She'd expected his presence to feel intrusive, but instead she found it oddly comforting. He didn't pepper her with questions or try to make idle conversation. He simply watched, alert and silent, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "What's that one?" he asked finally, as she knelt beside a cluster of small purple flowers growing in the shade of a boulder. "Skullcap," Elena replied, carefully harvesting the aerial parts. "It helps with nervous tension, anxiety, makes a good tea for people who can't sleep." "Does it work?" "Most of the time." "Better than whiskey, anyway, and without the headache." Lucas chuckled at that, a low, warm sound that seemed to roll across the hillside. "I imagine you see plenty of folks trying to cure their troubles with the bottle." "More than I'd like." Elena moved to another plant, this one with delicate white flowers. "This is valerian. Similar uses, but stronger. My mother used to say that the earth provides exactly what we need if we just know where to look." Sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Elena's throat tightened unexpectedly. 3 years wasn't long enough to erase the grief, wasn't long enough to fill the hollow space her mother's absence had left. She knew more about healing than any fancy doctor with his diploma and his Latin words. "My mother was the same way," Lucas said quietly. "She could cure just about anything with herbs and poultices. Saved my little sister's life once when she got pneumonia. The doctor had already given up, said there was nothing more to be done, but Ma wouldn't accept that." "Your sister recovered." "She did. She's married now, living in Wyoming with her husband and 2 little ones." There was pride in his voice and something else. Loneliness, maybe. Elena glanced back at him. "Do you get to see her much?" "Not as often as I'd like. It's a long way to travel on a ranch hand's wages." He paused, then added, "But I'm saving up. Figure in another year or 2 I'll have enough to start my own small spread. Nothing fancy, just enough to run a modest herd and maybe plant some crops." There was something touching about the quiet determination in his voice, the way he spoke of his dreams as if they were certainties rather than wishes. Elena found herself wanting to know more, wanting to ask about his plans and his hopes, but before she could speak, Lucas's entire body went rigid. "Miss Wright," he said, his voice low and urgent, "don't move." Elena froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "What is it?" "Rattlesnake. About 2 feet to your left, coiled up in that patch of sun." She didn't dare turn her head, but from the corner of her eye she could just make out the distinctive pattern of a prairie rattlesnake, its tail already raised in warning. The dry buzz of its rattle filled the air, a sound that made every primitive instinct in her body scream at her to run. "I'm going to come around to your right," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the tension she could hear underlying it. "When I tell you to move, I want you to step backward, slowly and carefully. Don't make any sudden movements." Elena's legs felt like water, but she managed a tiny nod. She could hear Lucas moving, the soft crunch of his boots on the rocky ground as he circled wide around her position. The snake's rattle intensified, its wedge-shaped head tracking the movement. "Easy," Lucas murmured, though Elena wasn't sure if he was talking to her or the snake. "Nice and easy." An eternity seemed to pass. Elena's lungs burned and she realized she was barely breathing. The sun hammered down on her shoulders and a bead of sweat traced a slow path down her spine. "All right," Lucas said finally, and his voice was much closer now, off to her right just as he'd promised. "On 3, I want you to take 1 big step straight back. 1, 2, 3. Elena moved, her body responding before her mind fully registered the command. Her foot came down on solid ground, and she immediately took another step back, then another, until Lucas's hand closed around her arm, steadying her. "You're all right," he said. "You're safe now." The snake, apparently satisfied that the threat had passed, slowly lowered its tail and began to uncoil, sliding away into the deeper grass with a whisper of scales on stone. Elena's knees gave out, and if Lucas hadn't been holding her arm, she would have collapsed right there. Instead, he guided her to a nearby rock, easing her down onto its sun-warmed surface. "Put your head down," he instructed. "Take slow breaths. You're going to be fine." She did as he said, bending forward until her forehead nearly touched her knees, dragging air into her lungs in great gasping gulps. The fear was starting to ebb now, replaced by a shaky relief that made her hands tremble. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I should have been paying more attention." "I know to watch for snakes. I always watch for snakes." "You were focused on your work," Lucas said. He'd crouched down beside her, one hand still resting lightly on her shoulder. "Could have happened to anyone. The important thing is you're all right." Elena lifted her head to look at him, and found his face much closer than she'd expected. Close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar on his chin, the genuine concern in those creek water eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, something she couldn't quite name but felt all the way down to her bones. "Thank you," she said quietly, "if you hadn't been here." "But I was here," he said firmly. "And you're safe. That's all that matters." They stayed like that for a long moment, his hand warm on her shoulder, her eyes locked with his. Then Elena became acutely aware of their proximity, of the impropriety of it, and she straightened up, putting a more respectable distance between them. "I think I have enough herbs for today," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I should probably head back to town." "I'll ride with you," Lucas said, standing and offering her his hand. She took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers as he helped her to her feet. Her gathering bag felt heavier than it should as she slung it over her shoulder, but she wasn't sure if that was from the weight of the herbs or the weight of something else entirely. The ride back to Sloane passed in a comfortable silence. Lucas had offered to let Elena ride his horse while he walked, but she'd refused, insisting she was perfectly capable of making the journey on foot as she'd intended. Instead, he'd compromised by dismounting and walking alongside her, leading his bay gelding by the reins. The sun was approaching its zenith by the time the small town came into view, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a single main street with a few offshoots. Sloane wasn't much to look at, but it was home, and Elena felt the familiar mix of comfort and frustration that always accompanied her return from the hills. "Will you be gathering again soon?" Lucas asked as they reached the edge of town. Elena glanced at him, surprised by the question. "Probably in a few days. I like to replenish my stores before they run too low." He nodded, seeming to consider something. "Would you mind if I rode along again? I know you don't need protection, but—" He trailed off, looking almost embarrassed. "I'd feel better knowing you weren't out there alone." She should have said no. She should have insisted on her independence, on her capability to take care of herself. But the memory of that rattlesnake was still fresh, and more than that, she'd found herself enjoying Lucas's company in a way she hadn't expected. "I suppose that would be all right," she said, trying to sound casual. "I usually head out early, just after dawn, to avoid the worst of the heat." "I'll be here," Lucas promised, and the smile he gave her made something flutter in her chest. They parted ways at the edge of town, Lucas heading back toward the Double Bar Ranch and Elena continuing on to her small house on the eastern side of Sloane. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it had been her mother's and it was hers now. The front room served as her clinic, with a long table for examinations and shelves lined with jars and bottles of herbs, tinctures, and salves. She'd barely begun sorting through the morning's harvest when someone knocked on her door. Mrs. Patterson stood on the threshold, her face drawn with worry. A small boy clutched against her hip. "Miss Elena," the woman said breathlessly. "It's Timothy. He's burning up with fever, and he can't keep anything down." Elena ushered them inside immediately, the familiar calm of her profession settling over her. The morning's adventures faded into the background as she examined the child, noting his flushed cheeks, his glassy eyes, the way he whimpered when she pressed gently on his abdomen. "It's not appendicitis," she said, more to reassure the mother than anything else. "Likely just a summer fever. They've been going around. Has he been drinking enough water? I've tried, but he just brings it back up." Elena moved to her shelves, pulling down jars with practiced efficiency. "I'm going to make him a tea from ginger root and peppermint. It'll help settle his stomach. And we'll need to get his fever down with cool compresses. Do you have ice at home?" "A little from the ice house." "Good. Use it sparingly, wrapped in cloth against his forehead and wrists, and I want you to try to get him to take small sips of this tea every few minutes. Don't worry if he can't drink much at once. Little and often is what we're aiming for." She worked quickly, steeping the herbs in hot water, straining the mixture, adding a touch of honey to make it more palatable for the child. Mrs. Patterson watched anxiously, bouncing Timothy gently in her arms. "He's going to be all right, isn't he?" the woman asked, and Elena heard the desperate hope in her voice. "He'll be fine," Elena assured her. "But if the fever doesn't break by tomorrow morning, or if he gets worse, you come find me immediately. Day or night doesn't matter, you come find me." "Thank you, Miss Elena. I don't know what this town would do without you." The words were kindly meant, but they settled heavily on Elena's shoulders. Sometimes the responsibility of being Sloane's only healer felt crushing, the weight of all those lives depending on her knowledge, her skill, her mother's legacy. What if she made a mistake? What if her herbs weren't enough? What if someone died because she didn't know enough, wasn't good enough? She pushed the thoughts away as she saw Mrs. Patterson and Timothy out, watching them make their way down the dusty street. Then she returned to her sorting, her hands working automatically while her mind wandered. She kept thinking about Lucas Morgan, about the way he'd followed her into the hills without making her feel weak or incapable, about his quiet competence, his easy manner, the concern in his eyes when he'd pulled her away from that snake. She'd known him by sight for years, of course. Sloane was too small a town for strangers. But she'd never really noticed him before, never thought of him as anything more than another ranch hand. Now she couldn't seem to stop thinking about him. 3 days passed before Elena went gathering again. She told herself it was because she'd been busy with patients, which was true. A ranch hand had come in with a badly infected cut, and old Mr. Grayson needed more of his rheumatism liniment, and the preacher's wife had needed something for her headaches. But if she was being honest with herself, part of the delay was nerves. What if Lucas had forgotten? What if he'd only offered to accompany her out of politeness, and now felt obligated to follow through? What if she'd misread the entire situation? But when she stepped out of her house just as the first gray light of dawn was touching the eastern sky, she found him waiting, sitting easy in his saddle, a second horse on a lead beside him. "Morning, Miss Wright," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Thought you might appreciate a ride today, so I brought Rosie here. She's gentle as a kitten, won't give you any trouble." Elena looked at the pretty chestnut mare, then back at Lucas. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't. But it'll let us cover more ground, and you won't wear yourself out walking in this heat." She couldn't argue with his logic, and truthfully, she didn't want to. The prospect of riding into the hills with Lucas beside her made something warm unfold in her chest. "All right," she said. "Just let me get my gathering bag." She'd ridden horses before, though not often. Her mother had always preferred to walk, claiming it gave her more time to observe the plants and the land. But Elena had to admit there was something pleasant about sitting astride Rosie, feeling the mare's smooth gait, watching the town fall away behind them as they headed into the open country. Lucas rode beside her, close enough for conversation but far enough to be proper. The morning air was cool, almost cold, a brief respite before the sun climbed high enough to bake the land. "How's the boy?" Lucas asked after a while. "Timothy Patterson, I heard he was sick." "He's much better. The fever broke the next day." Elena glanced at him. "How did you know about that?" "Small town. People talk." He paused. "They also talk about how you've got the gift just like your mother did, say you've never lost a patient." "That's not true," Elena said quietly. "I've lost several, including my mother. That wasn't your fault." "From what I heard, half the town came down with that fever, and a lot of folks died. You were barely old enough to be doing what you were doing, and you saved more people than anyone had a right to expect." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. With Lucas, silence didn't feel like something that needed to be filled. They rode deeper into the hills, following trails that only Elena seemed to see. She'd dismount periodically to examine a plant or harvest what she needed, and Lucas would wait patiently, keeping watch, his presence a constant reassurance. "Tell me about the ranch," Elena said during one of their riding stretches. "What's it like working at the double bar?" Lucas seemed to consider the question. "It's hard work, but honest. The boss is fair, pays decent wages, doesn't expect more than a man can give. I've been there 5 years now, worked my way up from general hand to one of the senior wranglers." "Do you like it? The work, I mean." "I do, mostly. There's something satisfying about working with cattle, with horses, being outside, seeing the results of your labor." He shifted in his saddle. "But it's not what I want to do forever. Like I said before, I'm saving up for my own place." "How much land would you need?" "Not much. Maybe 160 acres, enough for a small herd and some crops. There's good land available north of here, up near the Little Belt Mountains. Water, grass, shelter from the winter winds. I've had my eye on a particular section for a while now." There was something in his voice when he talked about his dreams, a quiet passion that Elena found compelling. "It sounds like you've got it all planned out." "A man needs something to work toward," Lucas said. "Something more than just the next day's wages." Elena thought about her own life, her own future. She'd never really considered anything beyond what she was already doing. Healing was what she knew, what her mother had taught her, what gave her life purpose. But was it enough? Would it always be enough? They spent several hours in the hills that day, and by the time they started back toward Sloan, Elena's gathering bag was full and her heart felt strangely light. Lucas told her stories about life on the ranch, about ornery bulls and clever horses, about bunkhouse pranks and cattle drives. She found herself laughing more than she had in months, maybe years. "Same time in a few days?" Lucas asked as they reached her house. "Yes," Elena said, and this time there was no hesitation. "I'd like that." Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Every few days, Elena would find Lucas waiting for her at dawn, 2 horses ready, and they'd ride out into the hills together. They talked about everything and nothing. She learned that he was 25, that he'd grown up in Kansas, that his father had died when he was young, and he'd helped his mother raise his 3 younger siblings. He learned that she'd been educated partly by her mother and partly by an itinerant doctor who'd spent a winter in Sloan, that she loved reading but rarely had time for it, that she sometimes felt suffocated by the town's expectations of her. The more time they spent together, the more Elena found herself looking forward to those early morning rides. Lucas made her feel seen in a way she never had before. He didn't put her on a pedestal the way some of the townspeople did, treating her like some kind of saint. Nor did he dismiss her knowledge and skills the way others sometimes did, men who thought women had no business practicing medicine. He simply accepted her as she was, respected her for what she knew, and seemed genuinely interested in learning from her. And if her heart beat a little faster when he smiled at her, if she found herself thinking about him at odd moments during the day, if she sometimes caught herself watching his hands as he handled the reins or pointed out a hawk circling overhead, well, that was her business. It was mid-September when everything changed. They'd ridden further than usual that day, into a remote section of the hills where Elena remembered seeing meadowsweet growing near a stream. The day was unseasonably hot, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Elena had dismounted near the creek, kneeling in the damp soil to examine the plants when she heard Lucas call out sharply, "Riders coming. 4 of them coming fast." She looked up to see him standing in his stirrups, his hand automatically going to the rifle on his saddle. Following his gaze, she could make out a cloud of dust in the distance, growing rapidly larger. "Could be nothing," Lucas said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. The riders materialized out of the dust, 4 men on lathered horses, riding hard. They spotted Lucas and Elena and changed direction, heading straight for them. Something about the way they rode made Elena's stomach clench with anxiety. "Get behind me," Lucas said quietly, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. Lena grabbed her gathering bag and moved to stand near Rosie, her hand on the mare's neck as much for comfort as control. The 4 riders pulled up in a cloud of dust and noise, their horses blowing hard, foam speckling their bits. The men looked rough, with weeks of trail dust on their clothes and hard eyes that raked over Elena with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down one cheek, focused on Lucas. "You there, Cowboy. We're looking for fresh horses. These ones are about done in." "Can't help you," Lucas said evenly. "These horses belong to the Double Bar Ranch. They're not for sale or trade." "Wasn't asking to buy them," the scarred man said, and his companions laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Elena felt fear spike through her. These weren't honest men down on their luck. These were outlaws running from something desperate and dangerous. "You need to move along," Lucas said, and despite the tension in the air, his voice remained calm. "There's a town about 10 miles south of here, Sloan. They've got a stable with horses for sale." 10 miles is too far on these broken-down nags," another of the men said. He was younger than the leader, with mean little eyes that kept darting to Elena. "And look, boys, they've even got a lady with them. Bet she'd appreciate some different company." "The lady is under my protection," Lucas said, and now there was steel in his voice. "And you need to ride on. Now." The scarred man's face hardened. "That sounds almost like a threat, Cowboy. You threatening us." Elena watched Lucas's hand move subtle and slow until it rested near his rifle. "Just stating a fact. You've got no business here. Move along." For a moment, everything hung in the balance. Elena could feel the violence in the air, thick and choking as smoke. Her mind raced, trying to think of something to say, some way to diffuse the situation. Then, in the distance, another sound. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming from the south. The outlaws heard it too, their heads swiveling toward the noise. "Law," the scarred man spat. "That's a damned posse." "Time for you to leave then," Lucas said. The outlaw gave him a look of pure venom, but he was already wheeling his horse around. "This ain't over, Cowboy. I don't forget a face." "Neither do I," Lucas replied. The 4 men spurred their exhausted horses into motion, heading north at a pace that would probably kill the animals within a few miles. Elena watched them go, her whole body shaking with released tension. The approaching riders turned out to be exactly what the outlaws had feared. A posse from Sloan, led by Sheriff Dawson, a grizzled man in his 50s with a tobacco-stained mustache. "You folks see 4 riders come through here," he called out as soon as they were in earshot. "Just left, heading north," Lucas said, pointing. "Horses were about run out, they won't get far. Those sons of bitches robbed the bank in Helena 3 days ago, killed a clerk in the process." Dawson spat into the dust. "What were they doing here? Wanted our horses," Lucas said. "We convinced them that wasn't going to happen." The sheriff looked from Lucas to Elena, taking in the situation. "You all right, Miss Wright?" "Fine, Sheriff. Thanks to Mr. Morgan," Dawson nodded. "You got lucky. Those men are bad news. We'll run them down before nightfall, hopefully." He gathered his reins. "You two should head back to town. No telling if they've got friends in the area." The posse thundered off, leaving Lucas and Elena alone in the sudden quiet. Elena found that she couldn't stop shaking, the fear she'd been holding at bay finally breaking through. "Hey," Lucas said softly, dismounting and coming to her side. "You're all right. They're gone." "They would have killed you," Elena said, her voice breaking. "If that posse hadn't come along, they would have killed you and taken the horses and I." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the horrible scenarios that were playing out in her mind. Lucas's hand settled on her shoulders, warm and steady. "But they didn't. We're both fine. The sheriff will catch them, and they'll hang for what they did in Helena." "You could have just given them the horses," Elena said, looking up at him. "They're not worth your life." "Maybe not," Lucas agreed, "but you are." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Elena found herself staring at him, at the intensity in his creek-water eyes, at the set of his jaw, at the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and worth protecting. "Lucas," she whispered, and she wasn't even sure what she wanted to say, what she wanted to ask for. He seemed to understand anyway. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I've been wanting to do this for weeks," he murmured. "Tell me if you want me to stop." He kissed her then, soft and gentle and careful, like she was something that might break. Elena's eyes fluttered closed and she leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering against her palm, as fast and wild as her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I'm in love with you, Elena," he said quietly. "I think I have been since that first day in the hills, watching you work, seeing the way you care for those plants like they're precious. I know it's too soon, I know I should have waited, but after what just happened, I couldn't keep it in anymore." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears, happy tears. "It's not too soon," she said, "and I love you too. I think I've been falling for you with every sunrise ride, every story, every moment we've spent together." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Elena let herself get lost in it, let herself feel the joy and the relief and the sheer rightness of being in his arms. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "We should probably head back," Lucas said reluctantly. "Like the sheriff said, those outlaws might have friends around." "I know," Elena agreed, but she didn't move, wasn't ready to let go of this moment. Lucas seemed to understand. He held her for a long minute more, his arms around her, his chin resting on top of her head. Then, with visible reluctance, he stepped back and helped her mount Rosie. The ride back to Sloan felt different. They rode closer together, and several times Elena caught Lucas watching her with an expression that made her feel warm all over. When they reached her house, he helped her down from the saddle, his hands lingering on her waist. "Can I see you tonight?" he asked. "Proper like, I mean. I'd like to call on you if you'll have me." "I'd like that very much," Elena said. "Come by after supper. I'll be here." He was true to his word, arriving just as the sun was painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink. He'd cleaned up, put on a fresh shirt, and was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers that made Elena's heart squeeze with affection. They sat on her porch as the evening settled around them, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Lucas told her more about his plans for his ranch, and this time he spoke about them differently, including her in the vision. "There'd be room for a garden," he said, "for your herbs and medicinal plants, and the house would have a big kitchen, plenty of space for you to work on your remedies." "You're assuming I'd come with you," Elena said, but she was smiling. "Hoping," Lucas corrected. "I'm hoping you'd come with me, as my wife if you'll have me." Elena's breath caught. "Lucas, we've only known each other a few weeks." "I know, and I'm not saying it has to be tomorrow or next week." "I'm a patient man, Elena. I can wait, but I wanted you to know my intentions are serious. When I think about my future now, you're in it. You're the center of it." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I need time," she said honestly. "What I do here, the healing, it's important. The people of Sloan depend on me. I know they do, and I'm not asking you to give that up. Wherever we end up, people will need healing. Your gift doesn't have to be confined to this one town." It was a fair point, and it made Elena think. She'd never considered leaving Sloan, but why not? Why couldn't she practice her craft somewhere else, help different people, build a life with a man she loved? "Give me time to think about it," she said. "About what it would mean, what I'd need to arrange." "Take all the time you need," Lucas assured her. "I'm not going anywhere." Over the following weeks, Lucas continued to call on Elena regularly, and their courtship became the talk of Sloan. The older women smiled knowingly and made predictions about wedding bells, while the younger ones sighed wistfully over the romance of it all. Elena found herself thinking more and more about Lucas's proposal. Not the marriage proposal, not yet, but the proposal of a different life, a different future. She started making notes on what it would take to train someone else to take over her practice in Sloan, started thinking about which remedies she could teach, which skills could be passed on. There was Mary Henderson, a sharp girl of 19 who sometimes helped Elena with the simpler preparations. She had good hands and a calm demeanor, and she'd expressed interest in learning more about healing. With proper training, she could handle most of what Sloan needed. Lucas continued to ride with her into the hills whenever she went gathering, and those mornings remained Elena's favorite part of any day. They talked about his ranch plans, about her healing work, about the life they might build together. He was never pushy, never demanding, but his steady affection and quiet confidence in their future made Elena feel cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. It was late October when Sheriff Dawson stopped by Elena's clinic with news. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "We caught up with those bank robbers about 50 miles north of here. They resisted arrest. 3 of them died in the gunfight, including that scarred fellow who seemed to be the leader. The 4th one is in custody, headed to trial in Helena." Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. "Thank you for telling me, Sheriff. Figured you'd sleep better knowing. And Miss Wright," he paused at the door. "Lucas Morgan is a good man. You could do a lot worse." She laughed despite herself. "Is that the official opinion of the sheriff's office?" "It's the opinion of someone who's been around long enough to recognize a good match when he sees one." He tipped his hat and left, leaving Elena shaking her head with amusement. That evening, when Lucas came calling, Elena met him at the door with a decision. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "About the ranch, about building a life together." Lucas went very still, his eyes searching her face. And I think I'd like to see this land you've been talking about, the section near the Little Belt Mountains. I'd like to see where you imagine building your house, where the barn would go, where my garden might be." A smile spread across his face, slow and warm as sunrise. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying I can imagine a future there with you, but I need to see it first, need to know if it feels right. And I need time to properly train Mary to take over here. The people of Sloan will still need a healer." "How much time are we talking about?" 6 months, maybe. Long enough to get Mary properly trained, to prepare the town for the transition, and to plan a wedding if you're still interested in having me as your wife." Lucas didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, right there on her porch for all of Sloan to see. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Elena could hear Mrs. Patterson whistling and clapping from across the street. "I'll take that as a yes," Elena said, laughing. "That's a yes," Lucas confirmed. "That's a yes to everything. To 6 months, to training Mary, to showing you the land, to marrying you and spending the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice." They were married on a bright April day in 1879, with most of Sloan in attendance. Mary Henderson had proven to be an excellent student, absorbing Elena's teachings with enthusiasm and showing real aptitude for the healing arts. The town had accepted the transition with more grace than Elena had expected, though there were tearful goodbyes and promises to visit. The wedding ceremony was simple but heartfelt, conducted by the same preacher whose wife Elena had treated for headaches. Elena wore a cream-colored dress she'd made herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Lucas had picked that morning. When he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, his hands were steady, his eyes locked on hers with absolute certainty. "I love you," he whispered. "Today and always." "Today and always," she echoed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They spent their first night as husband and wife in the hotel in Sloan, but the next morning they set out for their new home. Lucas had been busy over the past 6 months, using all his savings plus a small loan from the bank to purchase the land he'd had his eye on. He'd even started construction on a small cabin, working every spare moment he had. The land was everything he'd promised and more. Rolling meadows gave way to stands of pine, and a clear creek ran through the property, providing fresh water year-round. The Little Belt Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in spring. The cabin was small but solid, just one large room with a sleeping loft, but Lucas had already marked out where he'd build additions as they could afford them. And true to his word, he'd left a large section near the house clear for Elena's garden. "What do you think?" he asked anxiously, watching her take it all in. Elena turned to him, taking his hands in hers. "I think it's perfect. I think we're going to build something wonderful here." And they did. Over the following months and years, they worked side by side to turn the raw land into a working ranch. Lucas built up a small but healthy herd of cattle, while Elena established her garden and began building a reputation as a healer in the scattered communities around the Little Belt Mountains. Their first son was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy boy with his father's eyes who they named James. Elena delivered him with the help of a midwife from a neighboring ranch, and when Lucas held his son for the first time, Elena saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "Thank you for this, for him, for everything." The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. Lucas proved to be as good a rancher as he'd been a ranch hand, with an eye for good cattle and a knack for managing the land. Elena's healing practice grew as well, with people traveling from miles around to seek her help. She trained several women in the area, passing on her mother's knowledge, making sure it wouldn't be lost. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, came 2 years after James. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn determination. And from the time she could walk, she was following Elena around the garden, learning the names and properties of every plant. Lucas expanded the cabin as he'd promised, adding a proper kitchen, a room for Elena's medicines and supplies, and bedrooms for the children. He built a barn and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands they eventually hired as the herd grew. But no matter how busy they got, he always made time for Elena, for quiet moments on the porch after the children were asleep, for sunrise rides into the hills that reminded them of how they'd fallen in love. In 1884, when Elena was pregnant with their third child, Lucas's sister came to visit from Wyoming, bringing her husband and 2 children. It was a joyful reunion, with Lucas proudly showing off the ranch he'd built, and Elena immediately bonding with her sister-in-law over herbs and remedies. "He's so happy," Lucas's sister said one evening, watching Lucas play with James and Rose in the yard. "I haven't seen him this happy since we were children before Pa died." "You're good for him, Elena." "He's good for me too," Elena replied, resting a hand on her swollen belly. "We're good for each other." Their third child was another boy, born that fall and named Thomas after Lucas's father. The birth was harder than the previous 2, and for a few frightening hours, Elena worried that something was wrong. But Lucas stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement and love. And when Thomas finally arrived, small but strong, Elena knew they'd gotten through it together, the way they got through everything. The years rolled on, marked by seasons and growth and the steady accumulation of a life well lived. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Elena's reputation as a healer spread, and people came from as far as 3 days' ride to seek her help. She never turned anyone away, just as her mother never had. James grew into a tall, serious young man who loved working the land alongside his father. Rose became an accomplished herbalist in her own right, with knowledge that sometimes surpassed even Elena's. Thomas proved to have a gift with horses that bordered on magical, able to gentle even the most stubborn animal. In 1890, when Elena was 34 and Lucas was 37, they had their 4th and final child, another daughter they named Sarah. She was a surprise, coming 10 years after her next oldest sibling, but she was welcomed with joy by the entire family. By then, the original small cabin had been expanded into a proper ranch house, with a wide porch where Elena and Lucas still sat on summer evenings, watching the sun set over their land. The garden had grown into something remarkable, with medicinal plants from all over the region, some cultivated, some transplanted from the wild hills where Elena and Lucas had first fallen in love. Sometimes on quiet mornings, Lucas would saddle 2 horses, and he and Elena would ride out into those hills, just the 2 of them like in the old days. They'd gather herbs, talk about their children and their plans, and remember how it had all started with a stubborn woman and a concerned cowboy and a rattlesnake in a sunny patch of ground. "You ever regret it?" Lucas asked one such morning when they were both in their 40s, their hair starting to show gray. "Leaving Sloan, giving up your practice there?" Elena looked at him, at the man she'd built a life with, the father of her children, her partner in every sense of the word. "Not for a moment," she said honestly. "I loved Sloan and I loved helping those people. But this, what we've built together, our family, our life, this is what I was meant for. You are what I was meant for." Lucas leaned over in his saddle and kissed her, soft and sweet. "I love you, Elena Morgan. I loved you that first day in the hills, and I'll love you until my last breath." "And I love you," she replied, meaning it just as much as she had on their wedding day, maybe even more after all the years and experiences they'd shared. They had been blessed with 20 more years together after that morning. Their children grew and married and gave them grandchildren, and the ranch continued to thrive under James's management when Lucas decided to step back a bit. Elena continued her healing work well into her 60s, though Rose increasingly took over the more demanding cases. Lucas passed first, in his sleep one winter night in 1912, at the age of 59. He'd been out mending fences that day despite Elena's protests that the weather was too cold, and he'd come in for supper tired but content. They'd sat by the fire afterward, his head on her shoulder, talking about the grandchildren and planning for spring planting. "I'm tired," he'd said eventually. "Think I'll turn in early." She'd kissed him goodnight, told him she loved him, and those were the last words they exchanged. He died peacefully sometime in the night, his heart simply deciding it had beaten enough times, had loved enough, had lived enough. Elena grieved deeply but not hopelessly. They'd had 43 years together, 4 children, 12 grandchildren at the time of his death, and a love that had never wavered, never dimmed. She kept the ranch running with James's help, kept her healing practice going, kept living because that's what Lucas would have wanted. She lived another 10 years without him, long enough to see 2 great-grandchildren born, long enough to pass on everything she knew about healing to Rose and to Rose's daughter Margaret. She died in 1922, at the age of 66, sitting in her garden on a warm summer day, surrounded by the plants she'd spent a lifetime cultivating. They buried her next to Lucas on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the Little Belt Mountains and the endless Montana sky. On her gravestone, their children had carved, "Elena Wright Morgan, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, healer. She knew the earth's secrets and shared them freely." The ranch stayed in the family for generations, and the garden Elena had planted continued to thrive, tended by her descendants who inherited her knowledge and her passion for healing. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light hit just right, people swore they could see 2 figures on horseback riding into the hills together, a woman gathering herbs and a cowboy following to keep her safe, their love as eternal as the land they'd claimed together. Their story became a legend in the region, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires, the tale of how a healer and a cowboy had found each other in the wild Montana hills and built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. It was a story about love and partnership, about building a life together, about the courage to leave the familiar and embrace the unknown. But more than that, it was a story about 2 people who recognized in each other exactly what they needed, who chose each other every day, and who proved that the best things in life often start with one person simply caring enough to make sure another person is safe. From that simple act of protection grew a love that shaped a family, a ranch, and a legacy that endured for generations. And in the end, isn't that what all the best love stories are about? Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the quiet, steady choice to care for someone, to protect them, to build a life alongside them, and to love them through all the seasons of life, from first kiss to final breath and beyond.